You know, when we first started talking about doing a podcast about free and open source software, I didn't expect to ever have the occasion to talk about Sonic the Hedgehog.
Wait, which Sonic are you talking about here? Are you talking about like Sonic from the Sega Genesis? You talking about like Sonic Mania, Sonic Colors, Sonic Frontier? You talk about Sonic from the movie? You talk about Bad, Ugly Sonic? Like which like you talking about Sonic the Drive-In with the cherry limeades and the little chili cheese pups? What do you got?
I was actually thinking the Sonic who loves chili dogs is perhaps my favorite of Sonic's, but yeah, 3D modeling.
Oh! So we're going to be talking about the one from the movie, the good Sonic, the one
Sonic.
True Sonic.
Yes. Well, or the ugly Sonic, the Sonic that never was as well.
Well, I mean, he does show up in Chip and Dale, so
the Sonic that almost was, should I say?
I've got an important question for you, Brad. I think you're uniquely positioned to answer this. Does Sonic wear shoes, or do his feet look like sneakers?
Oh no, we should just get into this episode.
Welcome to the FossPod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
As always, this week's FossPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more at opensource.google. This week on the FossPod, we have Dalai Felinto and Pablo Vazquez from the Blender Institute, which maintains the 3D computer graphics software program you know as Blender.
I think I may have missed in the course of talking to them that the actual organization is called the Blender Institute. That's got such
It makes it sound a little sinister, I think.
Maybe. Or very academic, I think.
But I mean, the upshot on Blender is that it's gone from being, what people thought of as the open source 3D modeling program to this. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife at this point. It can do video editing, it can do video post effects, it can do 3D modeling, obviously. And over the last several years, since the, I think, 2.8 release, it's gone from a tool that people use to learn how to do 3D modeling and stuff like that to an actual part of pipelines in video games and movies and TV and all of these other places that if you had asked me in 2015 when I started a VR company, I would have said, oh, no, we don't need to worry about Blender. But now it's a core part of a lot of companies and studios' pipelines.
Yeah, it's funny talking to you before we recorded this. I assumed that, having run a VR company for some years, that you probably were just intimately familiar with Blender. But yeah, it turns out that you kind of had your time in that space before Blender really blew up. Like, it's the same thing we talked about with OBS, right? Like, Blender had its moment, its inflection point, where it was an open source tool you could download and do stuff with. But now it's like kind of the thing that, like you look at like just straight up like search interest over time in different 3D modeling packages, like Blender is the one at the top. Lots of people are cutting their teeth on it these days. Like, it's getting integrated more and more into actual working pipelines in, movies, games, you name it. We talked to Pablo and Dalai about all that sort of stuff.
Well, two things. One is when you're running a company, a VR company, you maybe don't, what the tool chain tools are because you're paying for them, but you don't necessarily use them on the day-to-day.
Sure.
So that's an important consideration. But yeah, I think they're still in their inflection point where OBS has kind of become the industry standard for video compositing. I think Blender is still in that point, and part of it is that the business moves a little bit slower. The rebuilding, like a video game studio that's been around for 20 years isn't going to rebuild their graphics pipeline overnight to support the new hotness because they've been working in the same tools for the last 10 or 15 years, and there's a lot of inertia in that pipeline. Same thing for like a film studio, like a Pixar or whatever. But what we are starting to see, and we talk about in the interview a little bit, is that as younger people come in who've been growing and learning their craft with Blender, they're starting to integrate in the pipeline as they get into those decision-making roles about studio infrastructure and stuff like that. It's a very exciting time for Blender, and it's a great conversation we have with Dalai and Pablo. So I guess before we get any further, we should probably, first off, we need to introduce a concept. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about USD files here. A USD is a universal scene description, which is a standard that was developed, I think, originally at Pixar, and it's basically like a container file for all of the assets that make a 3D model look like a thing that exists in the real world. So it's the mesh, the cameras, the lighting, the hair, all of the things that the rig sometimes in some cases, meta balls, all sorts of other, like there's a ton of different stuff that goes into that file format. And when they're talking about it, you can think of it as, hey, this is the good way to transition all of the different bits and pieces that make a 3D model look and move in a video game or a movie or a TV show or something like that. But now that you know that, we should let Pablo and Dalai introduce themselves.
I'm Pablo Vazquez. I work on the communication side of Blender and also user interface topics.
Hi everyone, I'm Dalai. I work as a product manager for some of our projects, a bit of as a developer, a bit of design, but officially as a development coordinator at Blender.
I guess what was the original impetus for the creation of Blender? I mean, in 2002, when you started, it was kind of unusual to, like, 3D editing was hard. Like it was computationally expensive. You were often using like really expensive workstations. The idea that you could use a free open source piece of software to do that work was really novel at the time.
It was, but actually 2002 only marks the beginning of Blender as open source. Blender went online in 98 as Blender, but the actual birthday of Blender is in 94, when Don Rosendahl made this little test app, just for fun, and then, hey, we can actually make games out of it. They wanted to make games, so they started making this software called Traces, and then they renamed it to Blender. But it was mainly to make games because the apps were just too expensive at the time, and just thought, okay, let's make a new one. That's also why Blender, being an in-house software, it was just so like relying on the shortcuts and hidden everything, hidden menus, hidden everything, because they were like 4 or 5 people. I added a button. I added a function. I don't know, use Control Shift Alt, whatever. Cool. And that stayed with Blender for a while.
UI was difficult.
5-10 people, but at some point Blender had 50 employees. But that was most of those lawyers and the sales team.
Although that is when they found that Blender as a software for making games was actually more, it was a better business than making games. So that's when they changed into, all right, let's sell Blender.
I'm curious, like Will said, the late 90s and even early 2000s, I mean, that was extremely early in terms of commodity hardware being out there that could do 3D animation. It was before very powerful GPUs were widely available. Even CPUs were not amazing. I mean, do you have a sense of who the average user of Blender was in those earliest days and like what they were running it on and what they were using it for?
There is something interesting about this period because the scarcity of the computers or even the ecosystem around developing a software to whatever end also shaped Blender the way it is. So Blender now, if you have to get a bit more technical, but Blender is coded mainly in C, and now it has a lot of C++ as well. But the only reason Blender was on C++ from the very beginning is because the compiler for C++ was rather expensive. And then instead, Tom had to decide on whether getting a new computer, because they were also very pricey, or to go for C++. So asking your question, like in the early days, I guess before Blender was open source, they were pretty much full Sun machines. Amiga was on the target audience. But Blender from the very beginning had support for Windows, Linux, Mac as well, I would guess.
Eventually.
So it had a user base which was already more diverse in that sense. It didn't only appeal to this one exclusive firmware.
Yeah, that's when they decided to make Blender free, available online, and then you could buy a license to have things like subdivision, like subdivision surface. That was crazy times. That was 98 when it came out, and then the people around the world just started using it because it would literally fit on a floppy disk. That's one of the reasons I started using it, because it fit on a floppy disk, and I could just carry it around. It was free, and there was a community building around it. Actually, even back then, even Brazil, Dalai is from Brazil. Brazil had one of the largest communities in the late 90s, early 2000s of Blender that created documentation, and I don't know, so sort of a passion already for the software.
I'm fascinated by the process by which Blender became open source, because you kind of had to crowdfund before crowdfunding was even a thing to raise the funds to buy the code base, essentially. Who owned the code base before you bought it back and made it free and open source? And like, what was that whole process like?
The Blender investors. So when the company the studio that was making games, Neo Geo, decided to drop that and move into making Blender as a software, the Not a Number company, that's the name of the company, Not a Number. They had investors, and at some point, Blender even had offices all around the globe, like an actual business. So the code itself, belonged to the investors of Blender, and that's what had to be bought back when the .com bubble burst in the 2000s. And for a year or a bit more than a year, Blender didn't have a future, basically. The investors didn't want to put any more money, and the code was locked, so they wanted to put it on a drawer. And that's when Don, the original author of Blender, creator of Blender, decided, hey, okay, let's find, the investors already lost all the money, right? So what if we get 100,000 euros somehow and buy Blender back and release it as open source? They agreed. There was a public letter even online about this. And that's how it happened. In 7 weeks, somehow all over the world, people contributed from like €5, €10 via bank transfer. There was no such thing as crowdfunding websites back then. And that's how it happened in 7 weeks, and finally being released on October 12, 2002.
I can't imagine how grassroots that campaign must have been. That's like a decade before Kickstarter even existed, right? Like spreading the word for something like that and convincing people to fork money over must have been pretty exciting at such an early time.
Yeah, it definitely was. There was something new for everybody.
We saw this initiative when it comes to crowdfunding multiple times in the Blender history, because right in the beginning, when Blender became open source, it needed funds to keep the organization running, eventually to have developers involved in the core project. And it started with the Open Movie project that on one hand provided funds for new development, on the other hand provided focus for what to develop and how to drive the community into the same direction. And at the time they were selling DVDs, they still be selling Blender manuals, but each of those DVDs was a mini crowdfund campaign. Nowadays, you would see how that could happen. Later on, when he had the Gooseberry, was a very ambitious project of trying to make a feature film entirely open source, entirely with Creative Commons content. And it failed in a way, well, in the main way, in the sense that
yes,
we didn't make the feature film. We made a short film out of the original pitch. But it was already very ambitious, and we haven't heard at the time you're trying to gather over €1 million via crowdfunding without having a established platform to do so. Very, very innovative. Don't always, from my perspective, I always see him pushing the barrier for that.
There's an interesting path for Blender, because most of the open source projects that have been around for this long started as like a passion project for 1 or 2 people. And then, they grew up over time until they reached some sort of threshold. And suddenly they realized, oh, right, I need to start making money with this so that I can pay some developers to work on it full time, because 100 million people are using this on the day to day. And you all started with, Blender started with, hey, we have people working on this. How do we keep this going so that we don't lose the momentum that we've built with this community and with this piece of software already? And like being one of the first crowdfunding projects was, I think, a key part of that. Looking at where you all have gone, where Blender has gone, it's transformed from this kind of single task 3D modeling program in the beginning until it's kind of a Swiss Army knife now for video production and VFX and 3D stuff and all these different tool sets. And I'm curious if that was, do you feel like that was intentional, or did it just evolve over time because of the projects you were working on internally as kind of your dog food projects?
I think that came from the nature of being an in-house software, and just basically you need some part of the pipeline. All right, let's make it. And in the end, that's why Blender had a game engine and the modeling and texturing and everything. And then at some point, okay, let's have video editing. And then that's how it evolved at the very beginning. And then once Blender became open source in 2002, for 4 years, the first few years were, okay, Blender is, most of the Blender code is in Dutch because Blender is Dutch. Okay, let's translate Blender. Then, okay, we have modeling, basic modeling tools. Cool. What is next? Texturing tools. Okay. And then the development itself went into this, okay, what we need at the time when we need to like make better overall, but it didn't really have a direction until the first open movie project happened in 2005 and 6 when with another campaign to, okay, let's make Blender a real all-in-one tool for film creation. This open movie project also brought the concept of compositing. It was, you can't make a film, a movie without compositing. So that's the first step. Then for the second short film, for example, it's like, okay, Blender's particle system sucks. What can we do about it? Let's make a film about a bunny, a furry bunny with other furry animals on land with grass. And basically all the development after that was always driven by a necessity of a specific project. The same with the next project with Sintel. It was about a better rendering. And motion tracking in 2012 was introduced for this live action film, Tears of Steel. And that's, I think, is a really good way of developing. And of course, we are a long way, but actually that's kind of some other companies do it too, like studios such as Pixar. They also always highlight one specific like technical challenge for each of the films.
It's interesting that you mentioned Pixar. I really apologize. I'm like a big VFX nerd, so I'll probably have a lot of questions about that. But I'm curious if you have any contact with any of the big VFX houses or animation studios, Pixar, DreamWorks, ILM, Weta. Like, do you communicate with them at all? Is there any kind of knowledge sharing or any sort of collaboration at all there?
There is in two different ways. There's like the ground floor employees, people animating, modeling, composing in those companies. A lot of them are using Blender, sometimes out their own initiative, because they can download it, they can solve a problem without having to resort to the entire studio pipeline to solve their problems. And those people, some of them are involved directly in the Blender development as artists, stakeholders. We know a few of them, we see them in conferences. And then we have the companies as a whole. So people talking and speaking on behalf of the companies. And we have an open dialogue with, I think I can mention like Pixar is they have common interests on furthering the 3D education in America, in the world, right? If you're interested in getting the top of talent, we want to help training them for early on. And if our studio is built on top of proprietary tools, it gets really hard to provide the same tool set you have in-house for schools and for training facilities. And then having Blender facilitate a lot of these. We also have a few companies which are directly helping the Blender development. More recently, we have Unity. They have, I think, about 8 or so developers who are knee-deep into the Blender code, trying to fix from things from the fluid simulation to I/O to other needs they see for their own user base or not. We have people from Facebook involved on the rendering part of Blender and helping out with the hair project. NVIDIA helping with USD. Intel helping with their own Embry BVH techniques. So they're like on the development, we have a lot of dialogue with those companies. We have also some companies' interest on using Blender and adopting this in their pipeline, although this oftentimes is directed to third-party people that can help and provide in-house support, because that's not the mission of the Blender Institute or Foundation. Is not to jeopardize this ecosystem that exists in the industry to help shaping pipelines, but we try to facilitate, to connect when possible. We have the Blender Conference, which is a big celebration of this, and we're going to have I hope next year, the first Blender Conference in America, which were intended to happen 2020?
Yeah, 2020.
Yeah, 2020, the year that we don't talk much about. But we want to be there also to be close to Hollywood, to be close to Pixar and all the animation studios.
talking about that pipeline of users, not. I mean, we'll talk about the animation pipeline and stuff like that later. But the pipeline of users, when you started, in order to learn 3D animation, the first thing you had to do was either pirate a really expensive piece of software, or go buy a really expensive piece of software, right? For the most part, there weren't a lot of free or open source 3D modeling tools. So like a lot of people, I talked to a bunch of artists before we did this because I work in games, and I was curious what their experience was with Blender, and a lot of them said, "Oh yeah, that's what I learned. That's how I learned how to do the basic stuff." And then I came and got a job someplace, and I had to switch over to Max or Maya or whatever the commercial product that was tightly integrated with their pipeline was. But I think that education path is a really important thing, because without free tool, like Pixar has said this for years, without free tools and a lot of people learning how to use this type of software, this class of software at a pretty young age, we won't have the number of animators and modelers and 3D artists that we need to continue making movies at the scale that they do, especially as like, we've gone from one CG studio in 25 years ago, 30 years ago to like what, I don't know, 50 or 60 studios right now are making, I don't know, there's a bazillion people making 3D movies at this point. And the games industry and all the different places that this work is happening, we just need more of those people. We need more artists that can do this work. And I'm curious how much of that is a focus for Blender, or if it's, if you all are just building the tools and that's just a byproduct.
There is a concept we throw around, which is the inevitability of Blender outreach. Might even say success, but at least outreach. Because as you mentioned, right now they are already in the industry, a lot of young animators, artists, which trained themselves at an early age with Blender. Now imagine in 5 years from now, because the YouTubers, the patrons, you see so many content being made for Blender by Blender experts. We see more and more this wave of new artists permeating the industry with Blender in their pocket. As I said, maybe they won't use it as the main tool for this first job, but when the time comes that the studio wants to switch the pipeline or a new studio is made, then they're ready to add to their workforce and bring Blender to this wider and wider audience. I think the fact that the studios are outsourcing more and more also contribute to that, because even though they are big players, we have Maya, we have a Soft Image, ZBrush, Substance, yada, yada, yada. It's still interesting to have interchangeability throughout the entire pipeline. So nowadays it's very easy for a studio to be operating in Blender, but within a bigger pipeline, but make sure what they do is interchangeable. I see Blender focusing maybe mostly on those small studios, small to medium enterprises, than to thinking about Hollywood as a whole. I'll quote Tom here in a way, like Hollywood is well off. They know what they can afford, how to make their movies. And if anything, Autodesk should be the one helping them to make their movies. Blender is a small entity here in the Netherlands with a lot of enthusiasts contributing to the code or to the design. And it's not up to Blender to change how Hollywood wants to make their productions, but we can guarantee that anyone in the world that wants to express themselves and tell a story have the ways to do so. And I think at some point, both of those worlds will converge. We see this happening already in the big markets of China and India. There was recently a AAA film called Triple R. It's the RRR. Mm-hmm. It's now in Netflix, at least in Europe.
It's in the US too, yeah.
Which use Blender for 80% of their VFX shots. And in combination with Animal Logic, I think MPC, other big names. But you see that Blender then being used for movies of that scale. And it's interesting.
Yeah, another big step I think is we try to stay in touch with people that are actually teaching Blender at universities, but it's very hard to keep track. I've seen that more recently, since 2.8, since the big UI refresh that Blender got a few years ago in 2008, started in 2018 and finished in 2019, that universities are actually teaching Blender more, but from what I heard, at least at NSC, at this animation festival a few weeks ago that is mainly driven by the students that are actually asking their teachers, their professors, if they can use Blender. And in many cases, they can. Or they just really don't care as long as the result is, if the animation school is more focused on the animation side other than the tools, they actually let them use Blender. And part of that is also the LTS program that guarantees that Blender will stick with one version being updated for 2 years, which also makes it easier not only for studios to rely on a Blender that it's stable and that the documentation is up to date for longer time, but also for schools and universities actually teaching that version.
LTS is short for long-term support in this case, right?
Yes.
Talking to the game developers, it seems like there's a fair amount of people, even from AAA to indie studios, that do their initial work in Blender and then move it over to Maya or Max or something like that to integrate it with the rest of the studio's pipeline. Do you feel like that pipeline work, for rigging and animation is specifically the issue, I think. Do you feel like that pipeline is a focus point, or is that just something that'll come naturally as you do different projects, dog food different projects internally?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that the rig is in a way the core of the pipeline. For something like games, I would say even movies sometimes. So the rig might determine what's going to be the whole pipeline for the entire animation, which is a big chunk of the work that goes for films, animated films, and games as well, but mostly films. And in that sense, there's only so much you can do. We see a lot of work being done in, again, interoperability. Oh, gosh. Interoperability. If you say it fast, it goes fast. For instance, to have GLTF as a standard format for the web, but also for games. You see USD, which is a format pioneered by Pixar that tries to unify the scene description, basically the file format, to try also to contemplate rigging, make it easier as well for you to go from one software to another. So I know also that for modeling is very common for people to use Blender, even for the game industry. We see some interesting development on Unreal and Unity porting procedural tools from Blender into their native editors or in-game tools. So while you can expect something which is modeled as a final model, a chair, a table, sometimes the artist builds something procedural. Let's say you have a desk that you can choose how many feet you have in the desk. And now with this integration, even within the game or the game IDE, artists might be able to still leverage this parametric pipeline even down the line. So maybe it's a way of saying that even for games, we're seeing also a lot of interest on Blender. We have Unreal as the first big patron for Blender since we started the new Dev Fund campaign and web page in 2019. And they gave us money throughout 3 years to be able to hire a few developers as part of the core team. And they're interested because even though they, as a game studio, might have their own pipeline to do Fortnite and whatever other games they do, they know that they have a big user base of indie developers or even big studios that can benefit from having a tool such as Blender. And in a way, the same goes for Unity and other open source game engines, but just to talk about the big players.
Yeah, I saw that Epic is at your highest tier of support on your development fund, but do they provide any actual development engineering support themselves? I mean, UE5 is really just starting to take off. I'm curious if they have any interaction with the actual software development process for, their interests or your mutual interests.
Not directly, in the sense of not as we have no developer from them contributing a patch to Blender, but we do talk to their engineers from time to time. We had a meeting about the hair project when we wanted to talk to them. Some of them were from different places in the industry. So by talking to Epic, to Unreal, we are actually talking to ex-Pixar, ex-Veta employees. It's very fruitful. And Unreal is interesting because their code base It's not open source, as in it doesn't have an open license, but it's open in the sense that you can look at it. And the overall understanding is that we cannot copy and paste their code to a open source project like Blender, but we can refer to their techniques and solutions to implement our own solutions for that. So for the 2.80 project, which started technically in 2016 with the EV project, which we are bringing a real-time visualizer in the viewport using game technology, we use a lot of the Epic solutions within Blender. Just because if you're doing a model in Blender and want to export to a game engine, it's convenient that uses the same solution. Otherwise, the shit are gonna diverge. So it's a win-win in that case.
I'm asking this question as a layperson, obviously not a software developer, but is it hard to look at somebody else's code and not, from a legal standpoint, not be able to use the code, but implement a solution that is similar but legally distinct enough that you're in the clear? Is that a difficult thing to do?
I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot reply, and I wouldn't reply, so I don't want to implicate anyone here. But also, not everything is patented. Sometimes the technique is known, and it's just a matter of deciding how to implement it. We had a case where, I won't get to the specifics here, but there's some random numbers someone might pick, so the shade of green goes away or another in the BSDF shaders, that if you get to use that, you can maybe have the same look and feel everywhere. And that's not reinforced by software patent, or no one is, I don't know.
No one owns magic numbers.
I might add that although Unreal didn't contribute with code directly, we have other companies. I mean, we mentioned like Intel, NVIDIA, just to name a few, which contributed both with funding but also with code. So with that, it's happening more and more. In the beginning, I remember I started to contribute to Blender, I think 12 or more years ago. And I remember that Tom had this belief that the way to scale for the Blender project is to have a small core number of developers working for the foundation in the institute, but then having studios employing their own developers that would basically help them with their own pipeline, but then also help to the Blender at large. For years, I saw this actually not working. I remember for Prometheus was the first feature film made with Blender back in 2000-something Argentina ago. It's an Argentina film. And they had one in-house developer who was super nice, Diego Borghetti. But for years that didn't pan out so much because it's easier for companies to throw money through the wall than to have an in-house developer and to understand how to even accommodate that. And now I think we're finally, once again, in a moment where first we actually invested a lot in the core team, which also means the onboarding is a bit better. The code base of Blender is more welcoming, more professional. We try to get decent documentation, but also then have partners that can afford to contribute in that level. Sometimes even studios, but so far we still see mostly development or research labs. So I'd say Facebook, NVIDIA, yada yada.
Do you feel like the third-party contributors are just building the things that they're looking for internally, or are like Intel and NVIDIA and those kind of companies looking at, hey, here's a thing that we think Blender needs, not necessarily to drive their hardware adoption or whatever it is, but just like this is a feature that we think Blender needs and we can build this in, we can build this for them and they contribute the code? Or a little bit of both, I guess.
A little bit of both. A lot of those third-party groups, they have their own agenda, but sometimes not. We had we have an AMD developer at some point, which because it wanted to improve the Blender multi-threading support. So he was trying to find if there was any part of Blender that could benefit from a better multi-threading. It is, I think, ultimately because they were trying to showcase the Threadripper, which is a AMD powerhouse. Yeah. But it's where exactly he would focus his effort was really up to the Blender team in a way. So it's a good midway. You also see now with NVIDIA implementing USD support, They, of course, they have interest on the Omniverse, so it's very nice for them that Blender can play that game as well. That game, can support the new ecosystem for the metaverse. But in the end of the day, they are very accommodating when it comes to basically play according to the Blender rules in the Blender field and try to see what is in the Blender agenda that aligns with their own interest and then help with that.
I'm curious about your view on where consumer GPUs are at right now. We've seen hardware ray tracing support and kind of a increased focus on machine learning hardware and stuff like that in fairly affordable consumer cards. Are there other kind of upcoming hardware features in that space that you're excited about or that you would like to see come about there and that would have like serious implications for what Blender can do?
Now I'm thinking about ray tracing, real-time ray tracing, which is already a thing, but still expensive. So I'm waiting for this to be more mainstream. We see the convergence of like real-time techniques and so-called offline techniques. So things we render out and things you can see in real time in a game. And personally, I'll just expect more and more of this field to converge. So we can, pretty much have what you see. I remember growing up, you'll see those video games which look very, very simple, like Resident Evil. And then you have a cutting scene which looked amazing. And now we almost have these in the video games where the cutscenes are just, they look the same as the game itself. And I think that's what we're going to get for the GPUs.
Yeah, but even besides GPUs, they just getting faster is allowing for even other new types of workflows. I think what Unreal is doing and what others are also attempting is the fact that you can create cinematics in real time. That is just going to change everything. So I think everything becoming more interactive is what is going to take the lead in innovation in the future. And Blender, it's still not fully ready for that in terms we don't have real-time ray tracing, or we don't have an interaction or a mode that is not relying on X frames per second, like a separate clock, like an interactive real-time mode. But it's in the plans, and I think that's where everything is leading, from VR to all sorts of these crazy devices that come out at SIGGRAPH every year. Yeah.
To shift gears a little bit, I'd love to talk about the project a bit, if that's okay. Like, I'm curious, Blender is such a wide-ranging piece of software. I'm curious how you structure the actual project to support the 3D modeling program, the video editor, how is it one unified team that's working on everything? Do you have small teams that are working on each individual component? What's the structure of the program that actually lets all of this different code work together? It's a very wide-ranging open source project, and everybody approaches that a little bit differently.
I might make it sound that the project is bigger than it is because of the way we're structured, but there's a lot of overlap and a lot of people playing multiple roles. But that said, we try to structure Blender itself with modules that can operate, give or take, with a lot of autonomy. So you do have the modeling module, cycles module, VFX, VSC, video sequence editor. And we try to structure Blender to be a modeler as well when it comes to the code structure. That's far from the reality. So we still oftentimes might break something in the modeling when you're changing something for the animation. But I think at the core of Blender is this idea of different modules, each module having stakeholders like artists, which are using the tools that can help to make the decisions. We do have a core module that's responsible for things that cannot break, like file I/O, so input, output, right? Reading files and the data structure. The dependency graph, which is something important. What else is in the core module? There are a few things which are like those things. We have a really high barrier of entrance, so not everyone can just easily contribute. But we try this way to give more freedom to modules. For example, the grease pencil, which they have a few modules which operate with so much autonomy that can really have their own pace of innovation, totally disconnected to the rest of the program, which might work as a two-edged sword, because sometimes some of those parts diverge too much in the usability, in the UI from the rest of the program. But we see some good surprises. In the case of Grease Pencil, we see Grease Pencil is the whole 2D support in Blender, 2D animation. We've seen already a few feature films made using Grease Pencil largely. One of them was nominated for the Oscar last year. I Lost My Body.
Yeah.
A really interesting piece, very artsy. I liked a lot, Frenchy. We had a short film, Unicorn. Is it a short or a long?
Feature.
It's a feature. Oh,
Yeah.
They saw it at Annecy. Unicorn Wars.
Yeah, Unicorn Wars, that's the name. It's a feature film and it's entirely made in Blender. They even, at the end, they said 100% made in Blender, and it was selected for the Annecy Animation Festival, one of the largest animation festivals. That was a big surprise, and all thanks to the Grease Pencil module, the 2D animation system module, that, like Dalai said, operates not only really independently. We try to, at least I try, I'm more focused on the UI side of things, and I try to keep an eye on everything is consistent. Same shortcuts for similar tools, same labels, same. It takes some time, but I think it's worth it. And another curious thing about the Grease Pencil team is that it's fully volunteer. All, like, the main developer and the artists that are helping, they're mostly volunteers. There is other developers that are hired, that are working at studios. One of them is working at a spa animation studio in Madrid, that they made the Minions film and Despicable Me and a few others. Klaus for Netflix. They hired Blender developers for Grease Pencil, and they are collaborating. But yeah, Grease Pencil is a good example of a fully, mostly autonomous, mostly volunteer side of Blender that is making a lot of people switch to Blender because of it. An entire new niche of people that had nothing to do with Blender prior to 2.8, like before 2.8.
I know folks who work in 2D computer-assisted animation, and I know that they're excited to have somebody that's actively working on a piece of software that they all use. So 3 cheers for Grease Pencil. Grease Pencil is a good example because it seems like you're adding new functionality to Blender kind of all the time. And I'm curious if it's purely like user research and user needs driven or project driven, or if you're looking at like, hey, the data structure for video and 3D models kind of works the same, and like we have the tools to handle these things. You know, is it easy to put this in or difficult to put this in? You know, what's the kind of approach and what's the priority internally?
They're a bit of everything, to be honest. Especially in a project that relies a lot of the community contribution. There's only so much we can guide people towards. And although we try to be strict sometimes, you know, if someone can make a good case for an obscure feature that might get in. I know I did my own pitch of very obscure features in Blender in the past, like fisheye camera, stereo support. It was my thing, like strange features. What we try to have, so the question is how to prioritize. You didn't mention that, but it's implied. How does one can bring a feature forward? How can someone contribute to the direction of the project? What keep people busy? What does a developer does when they had to decide what to work on next? For many years, that kind of changed a lot. We mentioned the open projects, and they were instrumental.
Open movie projects.
The open movie projects, they were instrumental to give focus to the development. And a lot of things happen besides the main features you need to implement, but those are the things you make sure at the end of the day are implemented and tested in production. And that means that sometimes are big features, sometimes it's a small button to help a test to be made faster. But the project grew a lot. We mentioned 2.80, not only Blender became more of a, let's call it a hit in the internet, but the team also became larger and large. I think we have nowadays around 20 people in the paycheck of Blender Institute and Foundation, not even a studio. including full-time employees to people working remote to people receiving a development grant to work in specific projects and specific feature sets. So with this scalability, there also came the challenge of, indeed, how can we work together? Because we also had a lot of developers used to work by themselves, which can work sometimes, but sometimes they can go astray and they can make some questionable design decisions. Not because they have shortcomings necessarily, but because, as I said, Blender is a Swiss Army knife. And if you don't talk to each other, each part is going to be very different than the other one, and you won't be able to close them together, to keep the metaphor working here. So more recently, we have been trying to work with a project, which is what you call project. It's something that has more than one developer working together, have someone that can sign on that, so a stakeholder. It has a design up front, ideally, tries to communicate progress to the community, to the stakeholders, to the board. We don't have a board, but it'll be like Tone and people that are around that are willing to give
the core module.
The core module when it comes to engineering as well. And it's been like 2 years since we started working with this idea of project. We had a few hit and misses. We're still learning on the way. Geometry nodes, which is a new part of Blender, which we've mentioned is the part of parametric modeling, node-based modeling, and some effects. It's becoming very popular. People are doing a lot of this. It started in like this. We tried to pull together a project. We wanted to try to work with the agile methodology, more specifically Scrum, something that people in software development are familiar with. And they say, okay, we first need to put together a team. So we had already 2 developers, 3, which were involved in the project, but doing separate things. We had Pablo, you helping with the part of the UI. We had Simon as an artist playing the role of the stakeholder, trying to decide what they need for the next project, the next open movie project, Sprite Fright in that case. I was working as a product owner / product manager. We had Jeroen helping as a Scrum Master, and then Jack as a lead developer, Jack Luke, and Hans as the other developer. And to this day, part of this team is still ongoing, doing now hair development. But for us, it helped a lot to first start something ourselves, get it right, and then involve the community quite early on. Because if you don't give focus, people still going to try to contribute to the project. Because it's nice, we have time in our hands. But we also learned that if we have a nice board with a list of, hey, those are nice to have tasks, but they're not must-have tasks, in the sense as we don't need to prioritize them right now. We might do it down the line, but if someone has the time and the energy and could contribute, be very welcome. You see this more and more. You're trying to have the modules having meetings, bi-weekly meetings open to the whole world, pretty much, where people can, mention what they are working on, or they can have a moment to be asked what they can contribute to. Something you mentioned something we call technical depth. So not only user-facing features, but things which are going to be worth in the long run. We try to do them as well as any big project, but it's just a matter of balancing. Are they really worth, the time to do it now? Can we live 5 more years with that?
Just keep sweeping the technical debt under the rug, guys. It never builds up. It's never a problem. That's my understanding.
No, of course not. I just wanted to add a small thing now that you're explaining how the geometry nodes, a success project, was so neatly organized with actual developers, artists, and schedule, everything. It's a success story. However, the similar happened with Grease Pencil. We were talking about Grease Pencil. The Grease Pencil project is just, I don't know, it's a good example of the community involvement that happens outside of, like, Blender can't really control. So the Grease Pencil feature, like drawing, like making annotations in Blender, has been there for many, many years, since 2.4, for over a decade. But it was just that. It was basically adding annotations. Somebody added, hey, we can add colors. Hey, we can add animation. And over time, people were using it. We were using the annotation tool for actually making animations. And it was a hack. There was even short films made with this annotation tool. And Blender wasn't even a part of Blender Foundation's like main goals to implement a 2D animation system. But someone from the community, it's an artist called Daniel Martinez Lara. He is an animation, he's a director, but also just an animator that wanted to make, he actually made a film with Grease Pencil before it even became the 2D animation tool that it is now. And just by testing things, coming up with ideas, with designs, with just really motivation, like passion for this, found a developer also he's from Spain, another developer from Spain, and another artist from Argentina. And the three of them just started making their own branch, basically their own side project, making this 2D animation system, which lately became part of Blender. But it's funny how Geometry Nodes, super organized, was a success, and Grease Pencil, and completely unorganized, just made out of passion for three people, became something that is part of Blender. So I see that happening more in the future. Anybody, I think you can have a roadmap for what Blender is going to be in 5 years, but you can't really map what it's going to be in 5 years, because people like this, like the Grease Pencil team, are all over the place, and we see even more and more developers jumping in. So
I just want to mention that Grease Pencil is very organized. From the beginning, they're using Trello to have their own list of tasks. I see more than once they say, let's not release this because it's not tested enough. You're going to already release it for the next release, and the other release, you also have a roadmap.
It's organized outside of them because they use Trello, which is closed source. We don't use that. They use Twitter thread to discuss things. And then we asked them to move into our Rocket Chat instance, blender.chat. So it is organized, but on their own independent bubble. Not anymore now. Actually, we are planning a workshop now that we have this building here where we can bring in people, we can fly in developers, there's grants that we can give, and there is a budget basically. So we want to bring them to the studio to map what is going to be Grease Pencil in the next few years.
So speaking of your budget and your building, actually, I watched the kind of office tour that Ton did. It's like a pretty nice building. I'm curious if you could talk some more about the development fund. I mean, we said earlier, back in the early days, you kind of did Kickstarter before Kickstarter, and then the development fund at a glance kind of looks like a Patreon style model. Can you talk a little bit about how that works, and how much of your costs does that cover? Is that kind of the core of the business?
It is nowadays. It's a bit of a funny and sad story. Well, not sad, but maybe tragic. No, not tragic. I don't know the word exactly, but it's so interesting how it developed, though. So the development fund, as a development fund concept, is actually there since forever. It was in the shape of one page on blender.org that had a PayPal address, and people could just PayPal you money to the Blender Foundation or bank transfer. That's it. For the longest time, it was just some people that contributed. It was around maybe $3,000 to €5,000, like $5,000 for the longest time, because we didn't really see a lot of, I don't know, I think we didn't see a lot of potential in it. Nobody ever thought it's like, hey, maybe we should grow this. Until
I think Tom was always shy of asking people money. That was one of the big barriers we had to fight.
That's the thing, because we were making films back then, and we were selling the DVDs of the films back then. So there was income for the studio, and the focus wasn't so much on making money from Blender. It felt wrong to make money from Blender. So yeah, nobody thought of it until the big 2.8 project. So in 2017, it starts to be planned, but in 2018 is when this campaign to make 2.8 happen. And in order for this big change to happen, you need to fly in developers. You need to do basically a crowdfunding campaign but much larger, for developers to come here. And we needed a bigger office. So we got a bigger office. This crowdfunding campaign showed that it was actually possible to have. It's actually financially viable. Companies are interested to have their logo slapped in our website. So why don't we make something about it? So with the system that we developed to get this crowdfunding, we kind of reshaped it, rebranded into the new development fund. allowing anybody to get a subscription and just show their name or not, if they want, on the Blender Development Fund website. And that exploded. Well, it exploded, and then I think it plateaued now. For a while, it's been, we know the size of the community now, but it's enough to maintain this office and many developers full-time. Many, we have a safe future, I would say. The Blender studio, like the film side of Blender, still having their own website, their own subscription-based website, where they share the training tutorials and all the assets of every open movie project that we make. So the learning side of Blender is still there, and still it's a subscription, $10 per month. You get all the assets, you learn how to use Blender, and you also help develop Blender. And the development fund is only for development itself.
There's something I like to mention, because the story we tell of Blender now is a winner story, but it's a kind of a survivor story, because even this big event for the Blender 2.80, so we tried to get, was 10 developers at the time, I think, 10 to 12 developers to fly here to Amsterdam, and then we rented a new place. The collateral for the new building, which is the building you are in, was Tom's apartment. Tom's personal apartment was online in the line there, because there's no other magical source of money that could be there for the stand up for the project. And we happened to succeed and keep getting big. But it's interesting to remember even that during the Code Quest, when we had the 12 developers were shaping up the future of Blender, we still had no safe future at the time.
No.
I remember I was here for 1 year during 2016 to help coordinate the Viewport project, so what became Eevee. And then I went back to Brazil, and then I came during the Code Quest to help coordinate the development team. And 1 week in, Tom invited me to his office and to explain me that even though we were working for we were going to be working for 3 months during the Code Quest, at the end of these 3 months, there was no fund. So he would help me to relocate and find a job elsewhere, to contact some of the people that are interested in Blender. But it was like a bit of a shock. We see this big success, we're growing, we're shaping up the future of the world, but bang, it was like a cold turkey, like, oh, this is going to end as well. It's a story we tell, a cautionary tale, just to keep us on our toes. And this lead history in 2019, everything changed, 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
I personally moved here already, applying to be a Dutch at some points. But it's interesting to look back and remember that, we are very lucky to have the people we have behind the project. So the community, the people that use Blender and understand that we needed their support to grow together.
It's very recent. All of this is very recent, yeah. And before 2016, before the Blender Studio make their own subscription system, every project, you would be hired for the project, and then you kind of have to find something else. So it's also making it really hard to get people on board. Then thanks to this subscription system, back then it was called the Blender Cloud, we managed to at least get a few artists working full time here. We were 4 people at the studio. And yes, just trying to, some will make the website, some will make the tutorials, which try to keep the website alive. And that was when, we were still in the previous office. And then the developers, but it wasn't easy. Actually, now that you mentioned, it's only very recent that we can have a stable future, I hope.
Yeah, after the folks I talked to that work in games, I feel pretty confident that you all have built something that is like, you're kind of going from the bottom up in terms of market penetration in the game space. Because I mean, it's like Dalai said, the people who grew up learning to use Blender are getting into decision-making roles about pipelines for future projects and stuff like that now. And I think there's one of the things that we found doing this podcast actually is that there's almost always an inflection point. And it sounds like for Blender, it was the 2.80 release probably. But I think there's probably another one in the future as more of the deciders, the young people become the old deciders. And it's not really a question. I apologize. I'm just rambling at this point.
Yeah, I know. I see your point. I think it is. Yeah, the inflection point is Blender 2.8, 2.80. The development fund and the fact that more people are actually using it and making it part of a pipeline. So as more and more of Blender becomes more like aligned with the industry, I guess, more of the USD sharing or like sharing shaders, assets, I think it's gonna go forward. Let's hope. We are planning for it. We have big plans. Don has big plans as well for what is the Blender Institute, Blender Foundation in the future to do, and how to ensure that Blender continues to grow as it is, and always try to develop as much as free and open source software as we can. The studio is developing like rendering management software as open source, and everything we do, we try to make it open source. And hopefully in the future, Blender could not only follow what is the trend, but also create its own in the shape of developing new, I don't know, get the paper researchers, like to actually use Blender and come up with something new that the industry can follow. One day, one can dream.
But I mean, that's the thing that happened with software like OBS, right? Is they reached a point where they reached parity with the commercial products, and then all of a sudden the number of people contributing went up and the number of new features coming in went up to the point that people with fixed commercial development budgets kind of couldn't keep pace with suddenly this massive open source juggernaut at that point. And at that point, it becomes kind of an organizational problem for the people who are the maintainers. I think one of the things we hear often is, hey, I need help with code reviews. I don't need any more people to submit to do pull requests at this point. I just need somebody who can understand the code base and help me check in code on the day-to-day. And I'm curious if you all have hit kind of those kinds of inflection points as well.
We are already at that stage. In a way, it's a strange conundrum, because we hire the top talents of people that have been contributing to the community for the longest. We have people that worked for Blender years ago, went to Autodesk, worked there. Went to Equisolid to help with Arnold project. Autodesk bought Arnold. Anyways, he came back. He's like, I think he's our most experienced developer. Yet, a lot of his time, he cannot sit and code. He needs to go there and help reviewing someone else's code. And we try to balance out for everyone's own good, like, because we want to, still be open for the community. But then we also want people to be happy. And it's not everyone that gets satisfaction out of looking at someone else's contribution. So we'll be trying to solve this by hiring for those roles, instead of hiring someone who show up to be a very prominent software developer, and then expect them to do a different role as being my coordinator and manager and reviewer. We try to then hire people specifically ahead of time, knowing, hey, you need someone in a senior role to interface with the community, to interface with the industry partners. But it's hard. It's very hard to hire. We're starting to pay more conforming industry rates for the team. It's still not there, but we happen to be in a city where there's a bubble still for the development industry. But people are doing okay. No one here is complaining about their paycheck. But if you bring someone from outside who might not understand the added value of being involved in an open source project, might be a bit harder to find people that we can hire. So the pool of people is still a bit limited. So that's one of our challenges at the moment.
Staying on the topic of Blender growing and being more widely used in different disciplines, but also touching on something you've mentioned repeatedly, which is the use of Blender in feature film. You've mentioned you have Blender Studio, you're doing your own films, and you've said, it's been used in short films and now Oscar-nominated films. Dalai, you retweeted something that really caught my eye, which was kind of an insinuation that Blender was used in the second Sonic the Hedgehog film, but the way that it's mentioned is a little cagey, like they're kind of talking around it, and the person who tweeted it mentioned NDAs in their replies. Did that raise any eyebrows around the office? Was it surprising to see Blender being used in like kind of a genuine blockbuster at that scale?
That wouldn't be the first one. I remember, this tweet was probably 1-2 months ago. So an eternity in the internet time. But I remember I think someone posted on Reddit acknowledged that they're using Blender for part of the pipeline. That wasn't really, I think Sonic 2 wasn't the most highly praised film, I believe. So in that sense, it's nice. We all grew up with Sonic. It's super nice. But I haven't seen even the first film. But for me, it was more. I remember growing up with Blender. So a few years ago, we see like Spider-Man 2 use Blender for some of the pre-visualization. That was crazy. We had the Avengers. I think the first film used Blender for some previews, but even at least for some previews, the pre-visualization for the title, but also for the hangar scene. Wonder Woman used Blender for the opening sequence. In that scale, Sonic 2 not being able to talk about this openly, kind of, it's more like a funny thing to tweet about it. But it's a shame because that's the thing, we're all movie nerds. We all grew up watching Pixar. We're crazy about it. I'm crazy about Toy Story and all. So for us, it's really resonate to a lot of us to see Blender being used in that scale for that project, those projects.
Yeah, and you know, if we take this tweet at face value, they seem to say that it was being used to finish a lot of actual shots that are in the movie, you know, not just previs, and it seems like...
Now, there's something every time we talked about how can Blender be integrated in the big studio pipelines, that is to say that how can you have Blender as a central piece in the pipelines, and that maybe it might never happen for the established Hollywood studios. That doesn't matter. But Blender is like really, really helpful for all of the big studios to be able to solve those problems in this pipeline, which might be very rigid, very established. And they may need like someone is trying to, in the rush time, try to fix the lightning of the shot, try to remove a car that was parked in the shot and someone forgot about it. The Starbucks cup on Game of Thrones, they could have used Blender to remove that.
Just another example that a VFX artist also working on a big series, just needed a few birds somewhere in the distance, and just wanted to have that, but you have to ask it's in the VFX, so it's at the end of the pipeline, so he needs to ask the animation department, modeling, rigging. He just downloaded Blender, the portable version, open it. You don't even have to install it. Just open it from the desktop, made some little birds, render, and had his birds.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, there is actually a Blender conference talk about it too.
I was going to say, I love the idea that, hey, somebody could just download the portable version of the app and composite the thing into the frame that they want. It's just so, I can't imagine. Like, you totally get yelled at Pixar for doing that, but there's a million small studios. You're like, man, that's awesome. Nice work, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I mean, that's kind of an example of like the mundane and the grandiose kind of meeting, because we've all done that, right? You know, like you might download like portable Audacity to tweak something in a little audio file or something. You know, like everybody has that experience of just grabbing a piece of software to do one little thing. But like, here's a case where that one little thing is like up on the biggest screens in the world, right? It kind of grounds the process, the creative process, to me, to know like, oh, they're sometimes just, you know, scrambling to get something done with the tools they have available at the last minute, just like me.
There's another thing that more available tools helps with, and I kind of think of it as the John Waters problem, because he's famous for saying, hey, look, if I want to make a movie for $1 million, I can raise $1 million, no problem. If I want to make a movie for $200 million, I can raise $200 million, no problem. But I like to make movies that cost like $10 or $15 million, and it turns out it's impossible for him to raise $10 or $15 million. And there's a lot of that in animation. There's a lot of that in what used to be B games, you know, video games that were in the B tier. And those studios have kind of either become big indie studios, or those games have just disappeared in a lot of cases. And I wonder if that's is that a thing that you see Blender helping with, or do you think that, you know, it's kind of, you're kind of soup to nuts at this point, which is a little bit of a weird place to be for an open source project?
I really see Blender helping out in that area, just bridging the gap between the very low budget and the higher budget that can't install anything new without asking their admins. And I think it definitely is is part of that change, and is leading that change. Also opening, because of having everything into one package, is opening people in a certain role to get involved also in other roles, and that's how you get innovation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy for me to see how important your tool is because I had friends back in the late '90s, around the turn of the century, who were trying to break into either VFX or game development. They were doing like amateur Quake mods, character models for Quake 3 or whatever, and they were all pirating 3D Studio and Softimage and stuff like that, right? Because that was all they had. But like a broke guy surviving on ramen can't pony up the hundreds of dollars for 3D Studio or whatever, so they were just pirating everything. And like now you don't have to do that because there's Blender, right? And like, do you feel like there's like a noble quality to what you're doing, that like providing that kind of freely available tool set to people who are up and coming has got kind of there's like a higher purpose to it, sort of?
I think there is, and also by enabling people from lower income countries that wouldn't be able to like even consider making this type of art or telling their stories, it's just a whole new like range of stories that we're gonna see, I think, in the future once they get the chance to tell their stories.
What do you think is the biggest challenge that the Blender Institute and Blender faces right now? It seems like things are trending upwards for you, but is there stuff you're worried about? Is there stuff you're excited about integrating? What are you all excited about? What do you worry about?
What I'm excited about. So excited about the Blender, the growth of Blender, and how it. Well, also a big fan of the 2D animation side. I want to see how that continues to grow. The real time side of Blender as well. Challenges that I see in the future, I think, is just being able to keep up with the demand of like the amount of bug reports that come in and that can be handled. Not all bug reports are done equally, and that I hope the biggest challenge is try to keep the team motivated in a sense, and active on what they really want to do, what they really want to innovate on their modules, without being covered. But when everything you do, literally every line of code you write is out in the public, it puts a lot of weight in developers, and I hope that doesn't demotivate them. That's a challenge. I don't know. I'm not even a developer. I'm just, but I can imagine how it can be challenging.
For me, I'll solve the challenge, and I think it's a bit of what you said. It's about the scale. We're in a turning point still, but I think we haven't crossed to the other side. We still have a lot of, it's not discontent or dissatisfaction, but you see that we all have this idea that things could be better, and you just don't have the time or the energy or the emotional space to do that. We've also been through some rough couple of years. I just said, like, the first Blender conference in 2-3 years. We scaled a lot, so basically, I'm really hope we can actually settle on where we are, on manage to hire up a little bit, to manage to give the team, be able to offload, a lot of the tasks, and be able to trust to equals and to be able to grow together. There's a big challenge of the diversity. I would say that it's still very hard to hire and have a more diverse team representative of the world. I was joking, indeed, it was, we are doing the hair development as part of the geometry nodes nowadays. And Hans is the one implementing some of the selection drawing. Hans is an American blonde guy, super nice fellow. He was here for a couple of months. And he was doing the shading, the selection visualization of the hair, basically in a way that everything that's selected is drawn in the final shading color, and everything that's not selected fades to black, which is fine if you're blonde. If you have black hair, you cannot tell them apart. And it's funny, he's totally aware of this, and for the hair is not a problem. But it's just a small example of how blinded we can be by being a bit of a bias both people. So I really hope we can be a company we're proud of, on looking around and saying, what? We're in a place where you are. And I think there's also the challenge of keeping the community involved. Because a lot of people feel like, oh, Blender now is well off, is having support from the industry, has funding from Epic and NVIDIA, and they might feel disconnected. But at the core of everything you do, it still is this animator, this artist who's working at a production film or a small studio or in a research lab, and which are instrumental to the work we do. So I really hope we can keep the community at the core of what we do. And yeah, honestly, that's also what I expect to the future. I thing in terms of exciting features that I'm looking forward is what I see every day already is exciting. The open films we see using the tools we develop, that's for me, it's exciting enough. So because I have this privilege of building things which are used on day zero, before they're committed, there are people using the branches and patches and doing already professional work with those things. So in that sense, I'm already very, very satisfied.
This is a jump back, but do you do external user research, or do you rely on the studio, the work happening in the studio primarily for user research and finding out like what you should be implementing and stuff like that?
User research might be a stretch, but both indeed. We, of course, use the studio as it's like a touching stone. We know that at least the people here should be happy with the things we do. And we know in the past that this wasn't even the case. So it's very, very important to have them be able to raise a flag. But nowadays, we have more and more people here in the studio actively joining the modules as artist stakeholders, sometimes on their own time, out of their own volition. And we know, for example, USD, we know that the industry is migrating towards some interoperable file format. Then we make sure we can accommodate that strategically. And in that sense, the Blender development is a lot of a top-bottom when it comes to big strategic targets. So we still try to leverage the fact that we have a kind of headquarters here that can put together like state-of-the-art artists and developers and try to every year come up with a timeline of things we need to implement. And so far, we're doing okay in that regard.
That's on the side of the studio. I think it's really important for Blender. It's very unique to have a software that gets developed by developers next to artists. Although one of the issues is that the artists that are here are like literally the best I know, at least, and they know Blender. Some of them have been using Blender for more than 20 years. I've been using Blender for 20 years. So we are a bit biased, as you can imagine. So the weekly, I host a weekly updates on the Blender Foundation YouTube channel, where every week I get to share what's new in Blender, what has changed. And that really made me and us open the eyes to new people coming up to Blender and how the new features and every change affects people in the community. We use Blender 100% for our films here, so we're not really aware what happens with the FBX exporter when you use it with Unreal, with like what happens when you export to ZBrush. Like, I can't help you there. But being weekly on YouTube, just reading what people are saying and how people react to the features, it really helps. So yeah, there is a balance between leverage the development on what the studio here, how can they help developing those features, but also how it's seen from a new user's perspective. We also have a website that is only about feature proposals. So anybody can go there and make a blog post on what they think this feature should change. And there are some really interesting proposals. And that's how we are trying to also read a bit of what's going on and what are the priorities for the community.
If people want to know how to contribute, what's a good place to start? Do you need help with docs? Do you need help with codes? What is the pressing need right now?
There is a landing page people can go that has a lot of information about that, which is in blender.org, think about or get involved.
Get involved.
Blender.org, get involved. We have a very friendly chat on the Blender chat where people can see the development, to have just to read the room a little bit and feel how is the back and forth in the development process. Depends a lot on the area the person wants to contribute. If he's a software developer that wants to help, usually we try to find what is the person's area of interest, because it's easier if you are working on something that you're passionate about. And then try to find if that part of Blender has a regular meeting, maybe that you can join. Usually a lot of the modules, they have, again, the tasks, which are good candidates for people to contribute. We do have a tag even in our task manager system for good first issues, which are really good for people, trying the water at first. Every now and then we have a group task force. We're going to have ones again soon for curves, where we have then a more coordinated effort, where we need a really sheer number of people porting code from one system to another one. You mentioned documentation. Documentation is ongoing effort, both in terms of translation of the Blender user interface, but also the documentation of the Blender itself in the user manual. Technically, if you're just using Blender, you are contributing to Blender already. Just keep doing that. If you can create content, tutorials in your own area, in your own social networks, that already helps a lot as well. People that might have ideas and designs, and this is a bit a more complicated topic because we try to filter it a little bit, because the amount of people that have something to say is more than we can afford to listen, given our limitations. But usually for those people, I would say get involved, try to find what's the current agenda for the module, help there, show as an artist, like show what you can do, show what you can do with the current system, which showstoppers we found, or maybe which workarounds you had to use. This is usually very good feedback we get. Pablo, you have something to add?
No, it's somewhat similar to what you were saying, is that many people come asking, like, well, how can I help? Or, yeah, what can I do? Or it would be cool if I do this or that. And if we look back actually to most of the contributors, they didn't ask. They just started doing it. And that's how most of the things are done. Like, for example, the real-time viewport, the new EV viewport in 2.8, wasn't a decision like someone said, hey, can I? No, they just made it, made a branch, and that now is the main renderer. They replaced the Blender internal renderer. And the same with, cycles also. Nobody asked for cycles. Developer just came up with a new renderer. That's okay. That's a big extreme case, but the same with pretty much everything. Someone would say, I would like to design new icons. Yes, that's nice, but better to just to come and have, hey, there's these 10 icons. Do you like them? Why can I do more? And yeah, there is such a volume of people and contributions that I think the ones that stand out are the ones that are already start by contributing. And yeah, that's the way to go.
Fantastic.
Not only by contributing, by making waves within their own circles. Because if maybe you have a contribution and then you're going to have to make a case about why it is important. But if you're already contributing, again, it's open source, right? You already have people excited about it, maybe people using it. Then it's more likely that, okay, you know what, that wasn't in our agenda, but since reasonable, we can work together, try to find somewhere. The other thing we need to mention is bug reports. There's a really nice way to contribute. Blender has daily 30 new bug reports, 20 to 30 every single day, including on the weekends. Not only can help by reporting bugs, but also by helping confirming bugs, trying to simplify the bug reports. So maybe you can help with some time, simplify the code to the minimum one object, one plane, one material that can lead to a crash. So there's a lot of places where people can help. The whole process we do is open, so it should be very interesting also to find your way.
I can't imagine the nightmare reproing bugs for a product as complicated as Blender. It seems like it would be intense.
And many times it's just the drivers, just update your drivers, but you have to reply to those people. Hey, please, have you tried reply? Yeah. So yeah, just going through the bug reports and testing and confirming or not. It's like, hey, yeah, this also happens to me in X version. That saves a lot of time.
Patches as well.
Patches, yeah, also testing patches, but even without compiling Blender, just downloading the example blend file that someone reported, and that helps enormously. Not just Blender, I think it applies to every open source project.
Thank you so much, Dalai and Pablo. It was awesome to chat with you, and I'm super excited about where Blender has come from, where it's going, and kind of what's next for the software.
Yeah, I left the little walk down memory lane for them too. Like, I didn't realize that they had kind of broken so much ground over the course of, first of all, I didn't even know that they had a 25-year history But also, yeah, in the course of that, you know, they crowdfunded, kind of did Patreon stuff. You know what I mean? Like that project has embraced a lot of really like forward thinking practices for supporting software online and getting the message out and bringing people in, which is very cool.
Well, the fact that they're building their own content to dog food the tools is another, like, it's a project full of really interesting ideas. I think there's a lot for all of us to learn from Blender. And I've been doing video editing with Blender since we recorded this episode.
Really?
So yeah, I started noodling around with it because I'm teaching my daughter how to do video editing, and we're kind of tossed up between using that and some more traditional closed source software. So it's been a fascinating experience. But anyway, this episode of the FOSSPod, as always, is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all of the value of open source to Google and all of the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more about Google's open source initiatives at opensource.google. Matt Purdy produced this episode, and Sabrina Hill edited it. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
I guess we will see you all. Actually, in a few weeks, we're going to take a couple episodes off here to kind of refill the hoppers. A lot of people we want to talk to are on vacation during the summer, it turns out, which makes it challenging to book episodes. And we'll be back in September with more FOSSPods. So thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you then.